For 3 years, the ancient stone corridors of Windsor Castle had not witnessed the small, energetic figure of Prince Louis during the Easter service. The last time he had attended, he was barely old enough to understand the solemnity of the occasion. He had fidgeted, whispered, and charmed the congregation with unguarded expressions that made headlines around the world. Then came the quiet years. The family withdrew. The cameras softened their gaze. The world learned, gradually, that Catherine, Princess of Wales, was undergoing treatment for a health condition that required privacy and rest. And so, Easter at Windsor became a smaller, more subdued affair, at least for the immediate family. But this year was different. This year marked a return. Not with fanfare or official announcements, but with a quiet confidence that the family was healing, step by step. The palace had released no grand statement. There was no pre-service interview, no carefully curated photo call. Instead, the signal was given simply by their arrival, the royal cars, polished and gleaming under the unpredictable English spring sky, pulling up to the horseshoe cloister entrance of St. George's Chapel. The date was etched into the royal calendar as one of the most significant of the year. Easter at Windsor is not merely a religious service, it is a reunion, a visible alignment of the monarchy's branches, a moment when the weight of history meets the informality of family. This year, the guest list read like a roll call of the modern firm, Princess and, stoic and tireless as ever, accompanied by Vice Admiral Sir Tim Lawrence. Prince Edward and Sophie, Countess of Wessex, walked with their characteristic understated grace. The Duke and Duchess of Edinburgh, as they are now known, have become the quiet anchors of many family events. There were cousins, second cousins, and members of the royal household whose names rarely appear in tabloids but whose presence fills the pews with a sense of continuity. And yet, as the cars began to arrive, one vehicle drew every eye. It was not the largest, nor the most ornate. But when the door opened and Prince William stepped out, followed by Catherine, the crowd's murmurs rose to a soft crescendo. Catherine looked well, radiant, even, in a tailored coat of spring green that seemed to echo the new leaves on the ancient oaks surrounding the chapel. Her smile was steady, her wave measured. Beside her, William offered a reassuring hand to each child as they descended. First came Prince George, now taller, his features sharpening into the likeness of a young monarch in waiting. He carried himself with a composure that belied his years, nodding politely to the gathered clergy and officials. Then Princess Charlotte, whose confidence has become legendary in royal watching circles, her chin high, her eyes scanning the scene with a mixture of curiosity and command. And finally, with a slight bounce in his step, Prince Louis. He had grown, of course. 3 years had transformed him from a toddler into a boy of 7, with unruly hair and a grin that seemed to contain multitudes. He wore a dark suit, like his brother, but his tie was slightly askew, and his shoes bore the faint scuff marks of a child who does not walk so much as propel himself forward. He looked around with unabashed interest, taking in the officers in ceremonial dress, the ancient chapel doors, the flutter of pigeons startled by the arrival. For a moment, he appeared as if he might wave to someone in the distance, a habit that had made him famous in previous years. But then he seemed to remember something, perhaps a quiet word from his mother, and he settled into a more subdued stance. The family lined up in their customary order, William and Catherine at the front, then George, then Charlotte, then Louis. The photographers, kept at a respectful distance, adjusted their lenses. The service was minutes away. Inside the chapel, the choir had begun its warm-up, a distant murmur of sacred harmonies drifting through the open doors. King Charles III, having arrived separately, made his way along the path toward the chapel entrance. He was dressed in a formal morning suit, his posture erect despite his years, his expression a careful blend of regal duty and genuine warmth. Behind him walked Queen Camilla, elegant in a pale blue ensemble, her hand resting lightly on the king's arm. They paused briefly to acknowledge a small cluster of well-wishers behind the barriers, a nod, a smile, the briefest of waves, before continuing toward the chapel steps. The royal family had formed a loose semicircle near the entrance, waiting for the signal to proceed inside. William and Catherine were speaking quietly with a senior member of the clergy. George stood at attention, his hands clasped behind his back in a pose he had likely rehearsed. Charlotte examined her fingernails with theatrical disinterest, a subtle rebellion that made her mother hide a smile. And Louis? Louis stood slightly apart, his gaze fixed on a small bird pecking at a crumb on the cobblestones. It was at this precise moment that King Charles reached the group. His eyes swept across the family, acknowledging each in turn. He nodded at William, who returned the gesture with a small bow of the head. He smiled at Catherine, who dipped into a graceful curtsy. He exchanged a wordless glance with George, a future king acknowledging a future king. Then his gaze landed on Louis. The boy had not noticed his grandfather's approach. He was still watching the bird, his head tilted, a small frown of concentration on his face. The king paused. For a fraction of a second, the formality of the occasion seemed to dissolve. This was not a monarch greeting a subject. This was a grandfather seeing his grandson for the first time in months, a boy who had been kept away from public life not by choice, but by necessity, by the quiet struggles of illness and recovery. Without any visible deliberation, Charles stepped closer. He did not crouch down or call Louis's name. He simply reached out, his hand moving with a gentleness that seemed almost out of place among the stiff collars and polished shoes. His fingers brushed against Louis's cheek, a light, tender touch, as if checking the softness of a petal. The boy looked up, startled for an instant. Then his face transformed. The frown vanished, replaced by a slow, unguarded smile. He leaned ever so slightly into the touch, a reflex of trust and affection. No words were exchanged. The king's hand lingered for perhaps 2 seconds, then withdrew. Charles straightened, adjusted his cuff, and continued walking toward the chapel entrance as if nothing had happened. Behind him, Camilla's expression softened, though she said nothing. William and Catherine exchanged a glance, a silent acknowledgement of a moment they would later discuss in private. George blinked, then looked away, perhaps embarrassed by the intimacy. Charlotte's theatrical inspection of her nails ceased. She watched, her eyes wide, then quickly resumed her composure. The photographers, positioned too far away to capture the exact gesture, could only guess at what had occurred. But those standing closer, the ushers, the clergy, a few senior aides, saw everything. And in that instant, they understood that this Easter service would be remembered not for the sermon or the music, but for a grandfather's quiet caress. Why did this moment resonate so deeply? Perhaps because, in an institution built on ritual and protocol, the unplanned and the authentic stand out like diamonds in a field of polished stone. The British monarchy has survived for centuries by balancing tradition with adaptation, formality with humanity. In recent years, that balance has been tested. Health challenges, family rifts, and the relentless glare of public scrutiny have forced the House of Windsor to re-examine how it presents itself to the world. Prince Louis, in his brief public life, has become an unlikely symbol of that humanity. He is the child who cannot be fully trained, the boy whose expressions escape the careful coaching of palace aides. He has made funny faces at royal weddings, covered his ears during flypasts, and waved with such enthusiasm that his sister once had to physically restrain him. Each time, the public has responded not with outrage, but with delight. In Louis, they see something rare, a royal child who is allowed, at least in moments, to simply be a child. This Easter, however, Louis did not steal the show with a grimace or a giggle. He did nothing at all. He simply received his grandfather's affection. And in that stillness, something profound was communicated. It said, "We are a family, not just an institution. We have weathered storms. We have known fear and uncertainty. But we are still here, still together, still capable of tenderness." For King Charles, the gesture carried its own weight. The monarch who had waited decades for his crown, who had navigated a complex relationship with his own sons, who had faced public scrutiny over everything from his marriage to his health, that same man reached out and touched a child's cheek with the ease of a grandfather who had no script to follow. It was, perhaps, the most genuine image of Charles as a family man ever captured, not in a photograph, but in the memory of those present. For Catherine, watching from a few feet away, the moment must have held special significance. She had spent much of the past year away from public life, focusing on her treatment and recovery. Her children had been shielded from the cameras, protected from the speculation. To see Louis welcomed back with such simple, uncalculated love, not as a prince, but as a grandson, must have felt like a small victory, a sign that the family's quiet strategy of privacy and healing was working. And for Louis himself, he may not fully understand the symbolism. He may not realize that millions of people would later read about that touch on the cheek. What he understood, in that moment, was that his grandfather had noticed him, had reached out, had offered a wordless blessing before entering a chapel where prayers would be said for the nation, the Commonwealth, and the family. That is enough. That is everything. The Easter service at St. George's Chapel proceeded without further interruption. The choir's voices rose into the vaulted ceiling, singing hymns that had echoed through these walls for centuries. The Archbishop of Canterbury delivered a sermon on hope and renewal, themes that felt particularly apt for a family emerging from a period of difficulty. King Charles listened with his characteristic intensity, his hands clasped, his gaze fixed on the altar. Beside him, Queen Camilla occasionally glanced toward the pew where William and Catherine sat with their children. Louis, to the relief of his parents, behaved admirably. He sat still during the readings, though his legs swung gently beneath the pew. He joined in the hymns with more enthusiasm than accuracy, his voice rising in a cheerful, tuneless hum. During the long prayer, he rested his head against Catherine's arm, his eyelids growing heavy. Charlotte, seated next to him, reached over and adjusted his collar without being asked, a small, sisterly act that made several nearby worshippers smile. After the service, the family emerged into the spring sunlight. The sky had cleared, and the ancient oaks cast dappled shadows across the courtyard. Photographers captured the formal departure, William and Catherine leading the way, George and Charlotte following, Louis bringing up the rear. But this time, Louis did not mug for the cameras. He walked quietly, his hand held by his father's. At one point, he looked back over his shoulder toward the chapel doors, where the King and Queen were still greeting well-wishers. Charles caught his eye and gave a small nod. Louis nodded back, then turned and continued walking. The cars departed. The crowds dispersed. The chapel returned to its quiet vigil. But the image of that brief, gentle touch lingered, not just in the memory of those who witnessed it, but in the wider public imagination. In a world of carefully managed images and crisis communication strategies, an unplanned moment of affection had broken through. It was not a policy statement or a political maneuver. It was simply a grandfather loving his grandson. And for that one Easter morning, that was enough to remind everyone why the monarchy, for all its flaws, still matters. Because it is made of people, and people, at their best, are capable of small, beautiful, unscripted gestures. To understand why Louis's return to the Easter service mattered, one must understand the peculiar weight of being a royal child. From the moment they are born, they are not entirely their own. Their first steps are photographed. Their first words are analyzed. Their tantrums become tabloid headlines. And yet, within the strictures of palace life, there is also an intense desire to protect them, to give them as normal a childhood as possible within the gilded cage. Prince Louis, as the youngest of the three Wales children, has had a slightly different experience than his siblings. George has always been aware, in some way, that he will be king. Charlotte has carved out a role as the confident, capable middle child. But Louis has been given more freedom to be unpredictable, more license to be the family's wild card. It is no accident that his most famous public moments have been unplanned, the hands over ears during the Platinum Jubilee flypast, the tongue-out expression at the Trooping the Colour, the exuberant waving that threatened to upstage every formal photograph. His absence from the last two Easters, however, was not a choice. It was a necessity. When Catherine stepped back from public duties, the children stepped back with her. The family cocooned itself in Norfolk, away from the cameras, focusing on health and healing. There were no official portraits, no walkabouts, no carefully staged interviews. For 2 years, Louis's public appearances were limited to fleeting glimpses, a hand held in a car window, a blurry figure in the background of a video call. That made this Easter a kind of re-emergence. Not just for Catherine, but for Louis himself. The boy who returned to St. George's Chapel was not the toddler who had charmed the world with his antics. He was older, calmer, more aware. He still had the spark. It was visible in the way his eyes darted across the courtyard, taking in everything, but he also had a new quality, a quiet receptivity, a willingness to be still and receive affection. The king's gesture, then, was not just a grandfather's impulse. It was a welcome, a recognition that Louis